After Glory, one soldier's story in the Civil War. 4 million soldiers fought in the Civil War. It lasted nearly 4 years and cost some 500 lives a day. The enormity of the numbers poses an obvious question. What makes any one soldier's story in the Civil War compelling to learn about? Is it his youthful patriotism when he enlisted at 15, just days after President Lincoln called for men to put down an insurrection started in Charleston, South Carolina? Or the heroics he displayed at 16, when he led a charge taking the last cannon in the capturing of the former capital of the South? An action for which he eventually received a discharge for a lost leg and the Medal of Honor for courage and gallantry. Maybe for what he did at 17, when as a citizen, he commanded 20 soldiers in the New York City draft riots. A controversial service for which he thought earned him the appointment in the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers despite having been discharged months earlier as an invalid. A regiment he raced to join and was with when they captured the fort featured in the movie Glory. A regiment of former slaves that after he recovered from typhoid he went with to a battle in Florida. A battle they were part of a brigade with the survivors of the regiment featured in that same movie. A brigade that came up from the rear and made a heroic stand to save those who went in before them. A front line stand in which he had his wooden leg shot off but stayed with his men on the line until nightfall allowed for a safe retreat. A retreat that witnessed the unbelievable scene of pushing a disabled train by hand for 10 miles to get their wounded to safety. No, although all these actions are interesting, they aren't reason for needing to tell his story now, over 150 years later. What does make his story needed to be told is what he did after he was promoted a captain and put on the staff of the Freeman Bureau in Charleston, South Carolina. That's when he and the others on that staff fought one last battle. A battle that had they won could have altered the course of American history. The battle started when the new president decided to undo the Reconstruction plans that were put into action in the final months of the war. General Sherman introduced the details of these plans in a special order he issued on the heels of his historic march to the sea. His order received the approval of the President and the Secretary of War. It subdivided large abandoned plantations into 40-acre farms to be granted to newly freed slaves. The lands used in Sherman's Special Order 501 originated where the war began, in Charleston, South Carolina. They continued south along the coast through Georgia and ended at the St. Johns River in Florida. The timing of Special Order 501 explains something of what it hoped to accomplish. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution that ended slavery was passed by the House the same month the order was issued. With slavery being abolished, something needed to be done for the millions of slaves being released from bondage. The idea to grant 40-acre farms provided a reasonable plan to have former slaves become self-sustaining and to reconstruct the Southern economy. The lands used in the special order were referred to as the Sherman Reservation. By the time of the surrender and days later President Lincoln was assassinated, 18,000 of these 40-acre land grants had been issued. During that same time the plan to grant 40 acres to newly freed families was replicated by the Congress throughout the South when they passed the Freedmen Bureau Bill. But, after Lincoln was assassinated and a new president took office, a completely different plan for reconstructing the South began. President Johnson, a former senator from the South, essentially reneged on the plan to grant lands to former slaves by issuing an executive order that returned lands to former owners, if the former owners signed loyalty oaths. Naturally, the former owners signed the meaningless loyalty oaths, and throughout the South the staffs at the Freedmen Bureau offices were told to evict freed slave families from their farms and return the lands to former owners. That's exactly what happened throughout the South except on the lands in the Sherman Reservation. At this office of the Freedmen Bureau, where Captain John Terry served, all applications filed by former owners to have lands returned were denied. The reason documented for denying every application stated that on lands in the Sherman Reservation the President Johnson's executive order didn't override General Sherman's wartime order. The refusal to carry out the President's orders started what could be considered was a second insurrection in Charleston, South Carolina. This one, unlike the earlier one, wasn't ended by what could be considered were overt means. While it went on, there were many unusual actions taken by a host of individuals. One of these was General Sherman, who wrote an op-ed that said he never meant for Special Order 501 to give permanent ownership of lands to freed slaves. Another surprising action was from Colonel Beecher, the half-brother of abolitionist and author Harriet Beecher. Colonel Beecher had to be reprimanded after he approved an application by a former owner in the city of Charleston. There were also actions taken by those who sided with the officers of the Freedmen Bureau. In one case, on an island just south of Charleston supervised by a Major Delaney, former slaves armed themselves to prevent anyone from taking their lands. Major Delaney was the highest-ranking black officer in the Civil War and in an earlier audience with President Lincoln received the president's highest praises. The standoff at the Charleston Freedmen Bureau office lasted nearly a year, and it surely would have ended differently if not for the pressure the president exerted on individuals to gain their support. Especially vulnerable were military officers who sought to further careers in a post-war military that was downsizing. In the end, with the help of his allies, the president was able to first slow, and then end the denying of applications at the Charleston office. The staffing of Freedmen Bureau's offices explains how this was accomplished. The Freedmen Bureau was created to deal with abandoned lands and to see to the needs of newly freed slaves. As a federal agency, it created offices throughout the South staffed by officers of specific ranks. To hold a position, an officer had to hold a specific rank. To get rid of officers at the Charleston office, the president, with the help of his allies, removed them after finding them guilty of questionable and outright false charges. That's what happened to John Terry, when he was demoted for missing a leg, which forced him to be removed. When John Terry refused to accept being demoted for a leg he lost 3 years earlier, he submitted his resignation. He lost the leg in 1862 and it was overlooked in 1863 when he was given an appointment. In the wartime years that followed, he fought on the front lines in other battles with a missing leg and was even fitted with a new prosthetic when his wooden leg was shot off. That's why he was going to forego any plans he had for a career in the military. Then, in an unexpected turn of events, before the resignation was finalized, he accepted a position with General Sickles to coordinate Freeman affairs. The new position allowed him to stay in the active military service until June 1866, at which time he completed the terms of his enlistment and mustered out with his former regiment. From 1866 until his death in 1919, John Terry attempted to do something about his demotion. Despite his hundreds of attempts, he was unable to regain his rank or the pension that would have come with it. It took years of research at the National Archives, of the hundreds of letters and applications, to finally gain him his long-awaited justice. Using those records, an application was filed on his behalf, and on March 20, 2015, the Army's Board of Appeals voted unanimously to restore his rank to captain. The success of this application demonstrated that a wrong occurring in 1865 could receive a fairer hearing in more enlightened times. There are compelling reasons to correct the records when what is learned of the past is found to be unjust. Much of what is done at any given time relies on what is known of the past. Misrepresenting the past provides a misleading guide for a shared future. We need to do what we can to correct this when the opportunity presents itself. That's why John Terry's story needs to be told. It highlights a major reason the Civil War was fought and why glory earned by so many was never realized. This is a story of a young boy who fights a war and after finding glory has it taken from him by a broken country and an assassin's bullet.